So good afternoon or good morning or good evening. I'm not sure if you took a break or if you come right back into this part two of my overview of evidence-based practices. And again, we're trying to connect to some of the readings you've had, videos we've watched, to review a little bit from class last semester in terms of the database elements, which of course, evidence-based practice is a key component of tier-based interventions, as is database decision-making. So back to our evidence-based, I'm not going to repeat our overview of this, but rather now think about, okay, Sean, so I'm starting to understand now and appreciate why we need to do evidence-based practices. We're remembering Mickey, but we're also now trying to understand, okay, yeah, but I'm in the classroom, and how does it apply? And that's a big question. We'll actually consider that a little bit for one of the assignments we try to tackle this week. But as we think about different resources, the Cadillac or the Lexus, or depending upon what car manufacturer you want to go in terms of high-end car, IES, Institute of Educational Sciences, What Works Clearinghouse, is the place to go for an understanding of what works in respect to practices. Now, if you haven't been here, finding what works is based on evidence, has a variety of different topics. And we're going to go right into, over here, right here, children's youth with disabilities. So we'll click on that real quick. And what you'll find here, as we slowly wait for it to load, is a variety of different practices. And let me make this a little bit larger for you so you can see. So what they've done is they've identified a variety of different practices, social skills training being one, dialogical reading being another. And we're going to talk about social skills training actually in a couple different resources here, phonological awareness training. And all of these take on a credibility in terms of evidence of effectiveness. Now you may say, well, Sean, how does it all work? And what does those symbols mean and all that? Well, that's something for you to take a look at your leisure. But what I want to reinforce is that these are shown to be effective. Now, for example, self-regulated strategy development. That's something I'm going to talk about here in just a bit. But SRSD, and actually when I talk about just a bit later on in this presentation, but also throughout the semester, particularly in the area of writing. Self-regulated strategy development is a strategy development for writing. And in it, there's what we know is that there's 9 studies that meet the standards in terms of writing achievement. And actually one study seems to meet the standards in terms of mathematics, which is a bit interesting because it's really about writing interventions. But basically they have a standard, they have a review process, and within that review process, they've determined, as you can see, a number of these interventions to be effective. Now, as you scroll down here, there's some that seem to have mild impact, okay? And then there's others that continue to be like play-based intervention for early childhood. There's a lot of good evidence that you would think behind this, but as we go into play-based interventions, I'm sorry, the internet seems to be a little slow right now. They're saying that play-based interventions for scope of early childhood special education, so individuals with disabilities, it's not meeting the current evidence standards. Now you may say, Sean, I know of several different research studies that deal with this. Again, IES is kind of like the very high standard. It may not be meet their standard, but it may show what we're going to talk about possibly as promising practice or other elements as we go forward. Now again, I want to reinforce this is the Cadillac. This is the big one, and it's not the only one. Instead, there's some additional ones to consider for evidence-based practices as we think about for individuals with disabilities. The National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder is one for autism. Current practices from Division for Learning Disabilities is something for learning disabilities, and there's a host of others. But let's go ahead and take a look at these. So let's take a look at the evidence-based practices when it comes to autism. And there's my social skills again. Right here, social skills is popping up there again for me. But there's also other elements. There's prompting. Reinforcement is shown to be what they say is evidence-based practices based on their standards that they've identified there at the National Center or National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. So for example, video modeling. Click on video modeling, and it's not going to show you how to do video modeling. It's going to give you an overview of the evidence behind video modeling. And so it's going to tell you the different types of research and things of that nature. But again, it's not going to tell you how to do video modeling, but there's some great resources out there to show you how to do video modeling. My point is instead that this resource is here to tell you about evidence-based practices specifically to that population. Now, to learning disabilities, let's go over here. The Division for Learning Disabilities has created, let me make this a little bit larger so you can see it, has created what's called current practice alerts. And within those current practice alerts, they generally will list things to go for, right? There are also some things to consider as caution. Oh, there's social skills instruction. But I wonder if it's not social skills instruction in general, but for students with learning disabilities versus students with autism, which is shown to be effective under evidence-based practices for individuals with autism. So there's again some elements to consider here. But let's go up under an area. Well, there's our self-regulated strategy development, as I mentioned a moment ago. Let's look at class-wide peer tutoring. And so what they've done here, and this is an old one. They looked at this years ago. We'll look at the PDF. Click on that. And what they've done here, and I'll make this a little bit larger so you can see. They basically tell us what it is. They tell us about for whom it was intended and how does it work, which is really excellent. They tell you how practical it is. Of course, it's all about practice. It's telling you about what works, but also the practice of it, how effective it is, how do I learn more, and there's some resources that are a bit dated. But this is the type of thing now, because I'm finding that, gosh, this is a credible entity under their current practice alerts to say this is something we should go for. Well, then I'm going to go find out more about class-wide peer tutoring. And I'm not probably going to use this resource for class-wide peer tutoring. Instead, this resource has reinforced the fact that it is effective. Instead, now I might find some practical application for it or some how-to steps, or maybe a YouTube video, some teachers showing me how to do class-wide peer tutoring. But this resource, again, is more to show about the evidence. Now, as we go forward here, there's also consideration, and this is something I wouldn't expect you to do, but I want you to be aware of how we've determined, again, what is evidence-based. And that is meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is a research design where you'll actually not do an independent study per se with your own participants in your own intervention, but instead what you'll do, in this instance is a perfect example, they took a look at graphic organizers, and they took a look at 16 different studies, 808 participants, and they analyzed those studies to determine how does it align in terms of effective outcomes for students with learning disabilities. And what they found was in reading and writing, it's very effective. So this meta-analysis is published. It's a few years back, and it was published in a Learning Disability Quarterly. And the whole idea here is it's now showing that the studies independently that have been done, remember, multiple studies, they did an analysis of those multiple studies and took a look and said, wow, this is effective as a practice and something to consider for students with disabilities, particularly students with learning disabilities. Now, besides evidence-based practices, there's also promising practices. And within promising practices, those are shown that, okay, we don't maybe have the evidence that we want to, but it's showing that there's some positive effects. The design may not be as clear as we'd like to, but there seems to be that it's led to some student improvement. And the number of studies may not be what we want. But again, those elements, as we kind of start connecting the dots, it sounds like, no, this is something we should consider, not ignore, and potentially start to implement while further research is being done. Because, of course, we don't want to wait for the years of the research to be done with elements that seem to be in nature from some initial work to be very positive. Likewise, and this is very, very similar, and for our purposes, I'd say let's leave it similar, and that is the research-based practices. Promising practices and research-based practices, to me, again, we have some initial research studies, there's some demonstration, there might be some question marks here. We need to know a little bit more. The research, its design itself is a little bit questionable, need a little bit more clarity there, and there's not multiple studies. But still, of some of the research that's been done, we're determining that the practice does have some potential success, just like promising practices. Of course, research that's been done to show it to be ineffective, we're not going to, just because it was research, we're not going to use it. It was shown to be ineffective. Now, I'm not talking about that, but promising practices and research-based practices show an alignment of some positivity there. Now, while I'm talking about those, let's consider some research-based practices or some promising practices. Reading theater, some of you may use that. Learning styles, it has some cautionary tale under what we just mentioned with Division for Learning Disabilities, and yet some potential application. Cornell notes, widely used now in middle school and high school, as well as upper elementary, and of course whole language has been out there for years. For certain populations, it has some considerations. Now, with that in mind, I want you to consider some resources out there that talk about some of these practices that for direct application. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Reading Rockets has a great resource for teaching reading, helping struggling readers, and things for teachers, things for parents, guides, resources, and the like for that application. Great resource for us teachers trying to make that connection between things that work and apply them to the individual. So definitely something to consider. Another element is Read, Write, Think, or Thinkfinity, as some of you may know it. And this is out of the National Council for Teaching English. And it has a lot of things in terms of literacy, reading and writing. They have standard-based elements, things that have been shown to be effective, promising practices, and the like. Now, Out of the sister National Council for Teaching Mathematics is Illuminations. This is also a Thinkfinity element. And here, I'll make this a little bit larger so you can see, here there's a lot of potential successes here about how to apply standard-based as well as promising practice-based interventions aligned with the National Council for Teaching Mathematics standards. So another good resource to consider. All right, so that would be an element for some of those research or promising-based practices. Now, literature synthesis, since I mentioned the meta-analysis, the synthesis is something to consider as well. And you've read some of these already, and you'll be reading some of these in your work going forward. It's a little different from a meta-analysis, of course. A meta-analysis is a study of studies, where this is more of just a synthesis. For example, in this one, it basically looked at peer-reviewed literature. Of course, we talked about peer review in the previous presentation for this week. But this looked at 10 years of work on interventions to teach basically spelling and reading interventions for spelling outcomes, particularly for students, and particularly for students with learning disabilities across basically grades K through 12. And with it, they found certain elements. And so they kind of synthesized these elements. Now, do they know in terms of overall impact and things of that nature? Have they done an analysis of the actual research studies? No, they've done an overview. But in so doing, they give you kind of a sense of what's being done out there. What do we know from that work? What potentially things we can connect the dots on, which would align ourselves potentially to promising practices, as well as some of those research-based practices. Maybe not evidence-based, but definitely giving us some research to consider. Now, I want to wrap up this element with two big ideas that have been come forward over the last several years when it comes to these ideas of promising practices, even elements of evidence, but also research. And that is high leverage practices. Sean, you give me all these different terms, but high leverage practices has come out of the University of Michigan in a collaboration that's really looking at teaching works and the like. And let me get to their website real quick and share with you what they've done is they've given you 19, scroll down to the bottom here, 19 different practices that they believe looking at and they've done this very systematically, looking at the basic fundamentals of teaching and what practices seem to be very high leverage. For example, leading a group discussion. And here's an overview of what they mean by leading group discussion. And they say this is a very high leverage practice that should lead to student outcomes, depending upon the grade and the subject area and the context being used. The same should be said for listening and interpreting individual student thinking. So these are all things that I think if you start jumping into, you'd start to realize, wait a minute here, oh yeah, I do these things, or I don't do these things at the level I should, or yeah, this is something I could actually better understand here very quickly and start to incorporate in what I do for my instruction. Exactly. Now, does it have the evidence behind it, maybe the evidence-based practice? Not so much, but it definitely has a notoriety behind the fact that it's being done if well, seems to have a good alignment to student outcomes. Now, I won't go back to the slideshow. Instead, I'll just go to the resource, and that is something called the special education high leverage practices, or the high leverage practices in special education. Now, this is a collaboration not out of the University of Michigan, but instead out of the University of Florida and the Council for Exceptional Children. And instead of 17, they offer, and we'll scroll down here to see the very bottom here, and you just see it's a little different structure than the ones we just saw a moment ago. And I'll stop here. I'm sorry to make you dizzy here. I just want to show you how many. So basically, we're going down to 22 high leverage practices. And each one, and let's scroll to the middle here. Each one offers us kind of an overview of what it is, an overview of the statement, and then what it is. So for example here, teaching cognitive and metacognitive strategies to support learning and independence. Oh, well, that's self-regulation. Wait a minute, Sean, I heard about that in the What Works. That's SRSD. Yes, it is. But even more so, these are learning strategies. Oh, I've heard of learning strategies, Sean, and we will be spending some time on learning strategies for Tier 2 and Tier 3 types of interventions. So these are things that are very relevant to that type of work and something to consider. Scaffolded supports. Of course we provide scaffolds, Sean. Yes, but scaffolds in a very specific way, both visual, verbal, written supports. They can help students in terms of evaluating their understanding, teasing out what they need to know, and better in terms of performance and understanding. And of course, explicit instruction. I don't know how many times you probably have heard this, but it's more than just simply that, duh, of course we're going to teach it very specifically. No, it's very explicit. It's an intervention in and of itself. And it's very specific in terms of how students can learn new materials, particularly complex concepts and skills. and how that can be facilitated to be able to address things of common misconceptions and things of that nature. So these are called the high leverage practices in special education, which are definitely different than those high leverage practices in general education. And we'll delve into this a little bit deeper as we go forward into this semester. And so as we kind of wrap up this second part of evidence-based practices, we've definitely kind of gone from evidence-based to research-based or promising practices now to this high leverage practices. So all, though, align themselves to what we would do in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 interventions for struggling learners, typically learners, and those with disabilities. Hope this gives you a bit of an overview of what is kind of, to me, the foundation of MTSS and where we're going in terms of our interventions for this meaningful inclusion for all learners as we go forward this semester.